At a cousin's engagement, my parents laughed about my imaginary fiance, so I toasted quietly but waited until he walked in, saying, "Sorry I'm late, had to park the helicopter," unaware we just landed from Dubai. My name is Ariel. I'm 33 years old and currently living in Dubai, where I run a creative consulting firm specializing in personal branding. My job doesn't come with a traditional title like doctor or engineer, but I know exactly what I'm doing, and I do it well. I build image strategies, craft media plans, and guide personal brands from anonymity to leadership in their fields. The work requires not only strategic thinking, but also intuition and a deep understanding of human psychology. Not everyone understands that, especially not my parents. I was born and raised in a small town in northern New Jersey. My family is of European descent, a typical middle-class household built on traditional values. My father is a civil engineer who spent over 30 years working at the same company. He's the kind of man who believes that stability is the ultimate marker of success. My mother was a high school math teacher. She always emphasized logic, structure, and control. They love me in their own way, but their love has always come with conditions. I had to become the person they expected. To them, a successful life meant graduating from a prestigious university, getting a respected job, marrying someone of similar background, and living close enough to come home for every holiday. They never said it out loud, but every piece of advice, every glance, and every comparison to someone else's daughter pushed me in that direction. And for most of my teenage years, I tried to follow that path, until I realized it wasn't mine. When I was 18, while my friends were applying to Ivy League schools for medicine or law, I quietly submitted my application to a design institute in France. I didn't tell anyone until I received the acceptance letter. I still remember the look on my mother's face when she opened it. She wasn't angry. She didn't yell. She just looked at me, a little longer than usual, with disappointment in her eyes. Then she said one short sentence. "You could do better." I didn't say anything in response, because deep down, I knew that wasn't encouragement. That was disappointment, turned into words. I went anyway. I left, even without their support. In the years that followed, I lived in Europe, studied and worked in the creative field. I lived in Berlin, then Stockholm, and later moved to Dubai for a bigger opportunity. I bought my first apartment at 29. I traveled widely, signed with major brands, and was invited to speak at a global conference on personal branding. But every time I called home, all of that was brushed aside by the same question. When will you settle down? To them, stability was never about feeling secure within yourself. It was about the titles they could mention to neighbors. A degree, a wedding ring, a job in a downtown office with a nameplate and a private elevator. I didn't have those things. What I had was freedom, passion, income, and a life that belonged to me. But to them, it still seemed like a phase. I've been in love, but none of the people I loved were the kind my parents could accept. They weren't American. They didn't come from the same class or background. Some were artists, some were photographers. One was a young entrepreneur from Southeast Asia. Every time I mentioned someone, my mother would quietly change the subject. My father would ask if I was sure he was serious. It didn't matter how kind or genuine they were. If they didn't fit the mold, they didn't count. A few years ago, I met Zayden. Zayden is Lebanese. He lives in Stockholm now, but his work takes him across countries. He's a strategic advisor in the field of aviation and aerospace technology. We met at an international conference in Istanbul. I was one of the keynote speakers, and he was a guest of honor. Our first conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. It wasn't because we had too much in common. It was because he was the first person who didn't interrupt me to counter or question. He simply listened. And when he finally spoke, I realized I had met someone who could understand me without needing me to translate every thought into something softer or safer. Zayden was unlike anyone I had ever loved. He was more grounded. He was calm. But more than anything, he wasn't afraid of my strength. He didn't see my success as a threat. He never tried to make me smaller to feel bigger. With him, I could simply be myself. We loved each other quietly, not because we had anything to hide, but because the world we had built was strong enough that we didn't need to prove anything. I didn't talk much about him to my family, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they wouldn't understand. My mother would ask what he did for a living, and when I answered, she wouldn't really hear me. She would only latch onto one phrase: not stable. There was one time I sent her a photo of me and Zayden from our trip to Jordan. She replied with a thumbs up emoji. Nothing more. I thought it didn't matter to me. I thought I had grown numb to the coldness. But I was wrong. I realized that the moment I received the engagement invitation from Annika, the cousin who had always been the family's example of perfection, the invitation arrived by post. It was printed on smooth ivory paper with gold embossed details, the names Annika and Rohan placed in the center, as if this wasn't just an engagement party, but a royal ceremony. I opened the envelope on a quiet afternoon in Dubai while making a cup of mint tea after work. I hadn't even read the official details when my eyes stopped at the handwritten note in blue ink, written in my mother's familiar handwriting. Hope your boyfriend shows up this time. There was no greeting. No, we hope to see you. Just one short line, gentle on the surface but cold underneath, as if she had pressed a crack into the clear glass that separated us. I stared at that line for a long time. Then folded the invitation, set it down on the table, and said nothing. I wasn't angry. I had grown used to this kind of mockery disguised as sweetness. I was just tired. Tired of always having to explain myself, as if standing before a panel of judges waiting for me to slip up, to say one wrong thing, just so they could erase everything I had ever worked for. I picked up my phone, took a photo of the card, and sent it to Zayden. Less than a minute later, he called. His voice was deep, calm, and still held that gentleness I loved. He asked me if I wanted to go. I stayed silent for a few seconds, then exhaled. I said I thought I should. I didn't want to keep running anymore. He told me he would come with me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He said I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, no matter what they thought. But if I wanted him there, he would be there. We decided to fly back to the US during Christmas week. Zayden had a presentation at an aviation conference in San Francisco, and I planned to reconnect with some old friends in New York. Annika's engagement party would span 3 days at a luxury hotel in the southern suburbs. The main event was on Saturday, which happened to coincide with Zayden's conference. He promised to come that evening after his meeting, traveling by helicopter. It sounded extravagant, but honestly, it was the most efficient way to move between tight schedules and remote locations that weren't easily reachable by commercial flights. I texted my mother to confirm that I would be attending. Her reply was short. Good. No questions, no mention of who I might be bringing with me. I knew that in their eyes, I was still the daughter who had no sense of propriety, the one who never said where she was going, who never introduced the person she was dating, who did things nobody in the family could really understand. The flight from Dubai lasted 14 hours. We landed at SFO 2 days before the event. I went straight to the hotel while Zayden went directly to his meetings. The first few days in the States always felt strange to me. Everything looked familiar, but it no longer felt like home. I passed old stores and cafes I used to know, but none of it brought back warmth. Only a dust-covered past and the echo of people who had never stopped questioning every choice I had made. On Saturday afternoon, I wore a long bronze-colored dress, my hair tied in a neat bun, and a pair of pearl earrings I had bought in Venice on a work trip. I dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look in the mirror and feel like I was enough. No matter what anyone said, I was still the one who had chosen this path and lived it fully. When I walked into the reception hall, it felt like stepping into an old film I had seen before. Traditional music played from hidden ceiling speakers. Tables were lined with gourmet dishes. Relatives chatted in clusters. The greetings were lukewarm, the hugs brief, the glances assessing. Polite smiles followed each once over. I passed through them like a shadow that everyone saw, but no one really wanted to touch. I overheard someone say my name. "That's Ariel, right? Still not married?" Another voice chimed in. "Didn't she say she had a foreign boyfriend? Still no sign of him?" A third voice added, "Poor thing. Maybe she's too embarrassed to bring him." I heard it all. I didn't react. I smiled, nodded, and kept walking. Annika, dressed in a crystal-embellished gown and flawless makeup, hugged me tightly. She had always been the only person in the family who never made me feel judged. She didn't ask about Zayden. She simply thanked me for coming. I wandered the room, took photos with extended family, sat at the bar with a mocktail in hand, and waited. Part of me feared Zayden would be late. Another part feared he'd be on time. I wasn't hoping for drama. I wasn't looking for a scene. I just wanted someone to stand beside me. That was all. Just someone to make me feel like I didn't have to stand alone in a room full of people who shared my blood, but not my choices. I heard my mother's voice from across the room. Loud, clear, like every time she told a funny story to the relatives. She laughed as she repeated what I had told her, that my boyfriend worked in aviation. She joked that no one had ever seen him. Maybe he was a pilot. Maybe he was a flight attendant. A relative added that perhaps he was just a made-up character, like in the movies. Something to save face when the real answer was too disappointing. They laughed loudly, not the polite kind of laugh, but loud, open laughter filled with triumph, as if they had just uncovered some grand deception. I stood a few steps away, glass in hand, my palm beginning to tremble slightly. I should have walked away. I knew that, but I didn't. I stayed. I let it land. I let every word settle in. There was nothing I could say. No comeback would change their minds. They had never believed me. Until he arrived. The first sound was a low, steady hum, almost unnoticeable at first. I thought it might have been the air conditioning or the background music shifting into another key, but it wasn't. It grew louder. A mechanical rhythm that anyone who had heard it once would never forget. In that moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. No one said anything, but everyone began looking around. One of the event staff rushed toward the entrance. All eyes followed his steps. I remained where I was, my hand gently tightening around the empty glass. The door opened. What entered first was light. A soft, gleaming glow streamed in from behind, cutting across the glass doors. Then his silhouette appeared, tall, composed, and confident enough to make the entire room step back and give him space. He wore a dark blue suit without a tie. His hair was slightly tousled from the wind. The watch on his wrist shimmered faintly under the ceiling lights, creating an impression somewhere between quiet elegance and effortless ease. He didn't have to do anything. He just had to be there. For a split second, the room turned still. No one smiled. No one moved. The tension that had lingered moments earlier dissolved like bubbles rising and bursting on the surface of wine. Every smirk, every judgment, every whisper vanished the moment they saw he was real. He walked straight toward me. He didn't pause. He didn't look around for anyone else. His eyes were fixed on a single point. Me. I didn't move. Not because I was surprised, but because for the first time that evening, I felt something lift. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to speak. Every question had already been answered in a way words never could. He stood next to me. Not too close, not too far. Just close enough that everyone knew this was where he meant to be. Just close enough that I knew I wasn't standing alone anymore in a room full of sidelong glances and polite distance. Around us, people began to murmur. Questions passed quietly from one pair of lips to another. They looked at him, then at me, then back again as if needing confirmation that this moment was real. A few of them, relatives who had seen me at countless family events, now seemed to replay everything they had once said behind my back. I didn't turn to look at my mother. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where she was standing, trying to gather the pieces of the calm, smiling face she always wore in public. But this time, that face wouldn't stay intact. I imagined her gently biting her lower lip, gripping the edge of her shawl, her eyes scanning the room as she struggled to understand what had just happened. My father, more controlled as always, would manage to stay still, but I knew even he couldn't hide the flicker of surprise. I could picture him watching Zayden closely, mentally linking every detail he had ever heard, wondering whether his daughter had in fact chosen right. We said nothing. We simply stood there, letting the silence speak in full. I felt a strange mix of emptiness and relief in my chest. Emptiness, because every bit of tension had finally left my body. Relief, because I no longer had to prove anything. Gradually, the flow of the room returned. Conversations resumed. Smiles softened. Handshakes followed. A few relatives approached us to talk. Some cousins, the ones who had once raised eyebrows behind my back, now came forward with polite curiosity. They didn't say it directly, but their eyes had changed. I was no longer the one they didn't understand. I had become someone with a story they hadn't yet figured out. I noticed how everyone listened when Zayden spoke about his work. The way they nodded. The way some even smiled when he described the projects he had led. A few started naming places near Dubai they had visited or asked about the industries he worked in. No one called him imaginary anymore. No one asked me if I was doing okay. His presence wasn't an act of revenge. It was more like a quiet declaration. A wordless answer to those who once believed I wasn't enough to have something this real. And I knew deep down that this wasn't just about him. It wasn't about the helicopter. It wasn't about the suit. It wasn't about the way he looked. It was about being seen. About someone choosing to stand beside me, not out of duty, not for appearances, but because he chose me, even when others were watching. That night, I didn't need to engage in a single argument. I didn't need to compare, or explain, or justify anything. I only had to walk across the room like someone who no longer needed to carry the weight of proving her worth. I smiled at Annika. I stood still in a silence I used to fear. But this time, it felt peaceful. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't standing alone. The party continued after Zayden arrived, but the atmosphere had shifted. The whispers softened. The critical stares turned into something else. More cautious, more curious. It felt like people were looking at a character who had just stepped out of a novel they never believed was real. No one said anything directly, but I could sense it. I could feel the way people began adjusting their perception of me. Not out of kindness, but out of the quiet instinct to self-correct, the kind people have when they realize they may have judged too quickly. I saw my mother standing at the far end of the hall next to one of my aunts. Her face no longer held that dismissive look she often wore. Instead, there was confusion in her expression, mixed with something wary, as if she was trying to reconstruct the version of the story she had believed for so long. I knew she was trying to find a way to approach me, but I wasn't ready. My father kept his usual distance, but this time his eyes carried something different. His silence no longer felt like denial. It felt more like the beginning of acknowledgement, as though something he once thought impossible had just become real. Annika was the only one who made me feel at ease. She didn't ask questions. She didn't stare. She simply watched and offered a small smile. The way she kept her own space, even in a room filled with prying eyes, made me feel quietly grateful. Not everyone in the family was the same. There were still people who understood that not everything needed to be on display to be valid. I stepped outside to walk around the small garden behind the banquet hall. It was quieter there. Paper lanterns hung from poles above potted plants. I stood still for a moment, listening to the breeze rustle through the leaves, and I felt strangely calm. That whole evening, I hadn't had to justify myself. I hadn't needed to prove anything through my words or my accomplishments. Zayden's presence had done that for me. Not by being flashy, just by being still, by being real. A few relatives came up to greet us throughout the night. Their tone was different now. Some started conversations with him, asked about his work, seemed genuinely interested in the things he shared. I wasn't surprised. People tend to shift their perspective when faced with something they can no longer control. The question was never really about right or wrong. It was always about who had the power to define what was real. When the dancing started, I stood quietly at the edge of the floor, watching Annika and Rohan move together in a slow rhythm. They were the picture-perfect couple, matching every traditional expectation. But for the first time, I didn't feel out of place. I didn't feel like a stranger watching someone else's life unfold. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Calm, steady, unapologetically present. Zayden came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the room move gently under the golden lights. No hand-holding, no grand gesture, just presence. And that was enough. Before leaving the party, I crossed paths with my mother near the staircase leading to the parking garage. She paused for a second, as if waiting for something. I didn't say a word. I just stood still and looked at her. She looked back at me, and for the first time, I didn't see judgment in her eyes. There was something else. Maybe curiosity. Maybe a bit of discomfort. As if she was seeing someone she no longer fully recognized, but couldn't deny either. I didn't expect her to change overnight. I wasn't waiting for an apology, but I knew something had shifted. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't loud. But it was there. A small crack in the wall I had been banging my head against for years. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. The kind of tired that comes after a long journey when you finally let your shoulders drop. I lay back on the hotel bed, stared at the ceiling, and felt empty in a way that wasn't heavy. There were no more questions echoing in my mind, no more doubts about whether I had done the right thing by choosing to live my life the way I had. I knew I had never been wrong. I didn't expect anything after the party. No messages, no calls, no sudden warmth from relatives. I was ready for the same kind of silence I'd always received. But this time, it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt more like the quiet pause after a long note, when people are no longer sure if they're still playing the same song. In the days that followed, a few small things happened. Small, but enough to let me know that something was changing. My father sent me a link to a Forbes article about airport infrastructure development in the Middle East. He added a short note saying he thought it was interesting. My mother sent a photo in the family group chat. It was taken at the engagement party. In it, Zayden and I were standing near the stage, both smiling. Her caption didn't say much, just one sentence. "Look who finally showed up." I didn't respond right away. Not out of anger. I just needed space to feel what it meant. Sometimes the quietest words carry the most weight, and I wanted to be sure that if any door was opening now, I'd walk through it because I chose to, not because I was still chasing their approval. Around that same time, Annika sent me a short video she had taken on her phone. It was the moment Zayden walked in. The light catching on the marble floor, the faint murmur of voices as he made his way toward me. She didn't say anything. The video came with no explanation, just a quiet gesture, a way of saying, "I saw it. You were there." Not as a faded side note in someone else's story, but as yourself, strong enough to stand alone, calm enough to not need applause. We returned to Dubai a few days later. The city welcomed me with its dry heat and the golden lights stretching across Sheikh Zayed Road. The noise of traffic, the wind sweeping past the high-rise windows, the blend of Arabic and English voices layered over each other like a kind of harmony. I didn't feel tired. I just felt like I had come back to a place where everything was defined on my own terms. Work picked up as usual. Projects rolled in one after another. Strategy meetings, private consulting sessions, and late nights writing campaign plans for public figures. I returned to my usual rhythm, but something had shifted. I no longer had to tell my story with hesitation. I no longer feared being misunderstood. And more importantly, I no longer needed anyone to validate the path I had chosen. A few weeks after coming back, I received an email from the organizers of the International Entrepreneurship Conference in Dubai. They invited me to be the keynote speaker for a session on building personal brands across cultural contexts. They wanted me to share my journey of building a business from scratch, with no investment capital, and how I scaled it through strategy instead of loud marketing. I agreed. But before signing the contract, I made one request. I wanted to invite 2 personal guests to sit in the front row. I handwrote a card and sent it to the US. It was addressed to my mother and father, nothing fancy, just one simple line. You once asked if I was serious about the life I chose. I'd like to invite you to come and see for yourselves. 3 days later, I received a message from my mother. 4 brief words. We will be there. I didn't know what made them agree. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe guilt. Maybe it had just been too long since they last saw me as anything other than their daughter. I didn't expect anything. I simply prepared to welcome them not with the hope of approval, but with the quiet self-respect that had been built from years of being doubted. They arrived in Dubai on a hot afternoon. Zayden picked them up from the airport in the electric car we had just bought. No private jet, no extravagance. Just a simple ride from the airport to our apartment, which had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the sea, an open kitchen with Moroccan tiles, and a living space I had designed myself. My mother looked around the apartment with quiet awe. My father didn't say much, but I could see the pause in his steps as he walked through the living room. It wasn't that they didn't like it. It was that they never imagined their daughter could create something this complete without their guidance. The following night, they sat in the front row of a hall filled with nearly 300 people from 14 different countries. I stepped on stage in a simple white suit, hair neatly tied back, the spotlight warm on my shoulders. From the podium, I could see my mother's eyes already welling with tears. I began my talk with a story about silence, about being told I wasn't serious enough, about the long journey to find my voice in a world that keeps asking women to be easier to accept. I didn't mention them. I didn't speak of the harshness of family, but I knew they understood. I saw it in the way my father clapped just a little longer than the others. I saw it in the way my mother stood up after the talk, said nothing, but didn't take her eyes off me for the rest of the night. They didn't apologize afterward. They didn't offer explanations. But when we had dinner later at a restaurant, my mother looked at Zayden, then at me, for a long moment. Her expression was no longer skeptical. It was quiet recognition. I didn't need her to say anything. I just needed to see it. And I did. They left Dubai 2 days after the conference. No one brought up the past. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no overflowing texts. Everything unfolded exactly the way they were. Brief, restrained, maintaining that safe distance we had always known. But this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like space. A pause to breathe, to look at each other differently. I didn't expect a miracle to happen after one visit, but I knew something had shifted. Maybe not full trust. Maybe not full understanding. But there was a crack in the perfect frame they once tried to place over my life. That crack wasn't wide enough for light to flood in, but it was enough for me to breathe easier when I stood beside them. Before they left for the airport, my father paused at the balcony. He didn't look at me. He looked out to the sea, where small boats moved slowly under the early sunlight. Then he turned to me and held my gaze for a few seconds. He didn't say anything. But I understood, and I didn't need him to speak. Some words lose their grace when spoken. That silence, for the first time, didn't make me feel alone. I walked them downstairs and stood at the curb until their car disappeared. On the way back to our apartment, I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel sad either. Just whole. Like a long journey had finally arrived at a resting point where I could stop, turn back, and quietly tell myself, "You did it." The days that followed settled into their usual rhythm. Work became busy again. Private meetings with clients, urgent strategic plans to finalize, long emails that needed careful replies, one line at a time. Zayden and I continued our habit of evening walks along the white stone path by the sea. Our conversations about the future, about work, about the dreams we still carried went on as always. But something inside me had changed. I no longer told my story with caution. I no longer softened my words just to make them easier for others to accept. I stopped saying what I thought would be easier to agree with, and I no longer paused when someone asked me, "What do your parents think?" For years, I had lived in that uncertain space, torn between wanting to be myself and longing to be accepted by the people who gave me life. I used to believe you couldn't have both. Now I know that sometimes you don't need both. You just need to be strong enough to keep going, even if no one understands. A few weeks after my parents returned to the US, my mother sent me a photo of a dish she had cooked using a recipe I once shared. My father sent me an article about a brand going through a visual rebranding with a short comment. Neither of them said how they felt about the trip, but I understood. It was their way of stepping out from the familiar lines they had always drawn. Not in a big way, but enough to show that they were no longer standing in the same place. I never expected them to change completely. I didn't need them to become cheerleaders. I didn't even want them to understand everything. I just needed them to stop trying to reshape me into something easier to explain. I needed them to accept that I am not like them, but I am still their daughter. Zayden remained by my side, not because I needed protection, but because we chose to walk through life together. He never tried to be the kind of man my family would instantly approve of. He just stood quietly beside me, steady like a landmark that would not move. One morning, while I was making coffee and watching the sunlight fall across the tiled balcony floor, I thought of the version of myself from years ago. The girl who felt like she was always wrong when she didn't meet expectations. The girl who shrank during family gatherings, wondering if she had made up her happiness to hide the loneliness underneath. My story doesn't end with a dramatic apology. There was no tearful reunion. No promise that everything would finally be perfect. But maybe this is enough. Because in the end, I stopped living to make others feel comfortable. I started living with the quiet understanding that I don't need to be loved in the old ways. I can be seen in new ways. I can be seen by myself. I used to think that love meant becoming who others wanted me to be. I believed that if I tried hard enough, if I was good enough, quiet enough, strong enough, someone would eventually look at me and nod with approval. But validation does not come from shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's world. It comes from standing tall even when eyes are skeptical. It comes from no longer needing praise to believe you're enough. It comes when you stop waiting for apologies just to feel worthy. I'm not telling this story to prove that I was right. I'm not telling it to change anyone's mind about me. I'm telling it because if you carry something for too long in silence, there won't be room left in your heart for anything new. I used to think my worth came from how others saw me, but now I know it comes from choosing to live as who I am. Even if no one claps, even if no one understands, even if I sometimes feel alone. Not everyone is born into a family that sees them clearly, but everyone has the right to create a life where they don't need permission to be whole. I don't need anyone to regret what they did. I only need enough lightness in my heart to keep walking forward. Enough strength to never again let someone else define what joy should look like for me. And if you hear this and recognize yourself in any part of it, know that you are not the only one. There are so many women like us who were once quiet, who were overlooked, who were dismissed, and who eventually stood up and told their stories on their own terms. If you're looking for stories like that, or simply searching for a voice that feels a little like yours in a world that often speaks too loud, then you found the right place. This is her side of the story, where stories are told not to blame, but to heal, not to argue, but to be heard. And sometimes that's all we need.